Alright, so this intro is just to inform you that this isn't actually designed to be a tutorial or a step-by-step guide. It's actually for a school project, so what I'm showing you now is just a bit of documentation, some of the electrical diagrams that I either drew or found online that I use for this project. But it's not designed to be a tutorial, just letting you know that now.
All right, so this is a 1990s-ish Craftsman riding lawnmower. It's been a couple months since it ran, and it doesn't run, which is why I'm gonna work on it. It's got a no start issue of put a freshly charged battery in it, turn the key, it's got gas, and it won't start. So it's got some kind of electrical problem. Starter motor doesn't click, solenoid doesn't click, absolutely nothing. So I'm gonna pull it apart, hunt down some things with a multimeter, and we'll see why it won't start. All right, so I got the hood open. It's an 18.5 horsepower Kohler opposed twin. I don't necessarily care for this motor. I'm more impartial to Briggs, but I got the battery thrown in it right off the charger, and according to the multimeter, it's just about 14 volts, which is what it should be at. So if I come back over here, try to go for the key, nothing, no clicking, no noises or anything. So it's a bit more tricky to diagnose, so we're gonna kind of hop all over with the multimeter, check a couple of things. Not in any particular order, but the order that I'm gonna just do it because I feel like it, and we'll see what we find. So on this side of the tractor, one of the first things that I'm gonna check is the ground, just because that rules out one of the biggest possibilities, so we don't go hunting on the positive side of the spectrum and then realize that that's not the problem. So over here on this ground bolt, if I contact it over here, it's upside down, but it doesn't appear to be reading anything. If I get it on the actual copper of the wire, now it's reading the correct rating, but if I hop down to this bolt, it's not reading the correct rating. So what I'm gonna do is pull this whole cable off and unbolt it here and here, and then clean the whole thing off on both ends really good with a wire brush, the bolt off with a wire brush, the frame off with a wire brush, and see if I can get a good ground. All right, so here's what the cable looks like before. The camera will focus. It's not bad. It's also not great, so I'll get this cleaned up and we'll see what it looks like after. All right, so after cleaning it, you can see that looks a lot better. You can actually see the copper, the cable actually shines like it's supposed to. I also cleaned up the bolt. The camera wants to focus. Clean up the bolt with the threads, and then over here, I got in there with a tiny wire brush and kind of cleaned out the threads too. So I'll reassemble it and we'll do testing again. All right, so now that everything's back together and the multimeter is hooked back up, if we go on the copper wire, we can see our almost 14 volts. And if we actually go on the bolt this time, you can see that we're actually reading it. Now I think the reason why I put it on the frame is because it's covered in paint. Let's see, if I try this bolt here, then yeah. So with this other bolt, we're also getting the 14 volts. So now that it looks like we have a really solid ground, if I disconnect this real quick, I don't know if that's the full issue. Yeah. So while the ground is now fixed, still got no start. So we ruled out the easiest problem. Now we got to go attack the hot side of the circuit. All right, so on the hot side of the circuit, basically how this works is the positive cable comes into the hot side of the solenoid and also through that wire right there, and that takes it to the ignition switch. When you turn the key to the start position, it sends 12 volt from the switch into these posts on the solenoid. Those posts then click over, which will then send power down this cable into the starter motor, which spins the engine. So the first thing I want to look at is this fuse in here. This is the only fuse on the tractor. So I don't know if the camera will focus, but that is intact internally. However, something's up with that contact there. So I'm gonna replace this fuse. This is a 30 fuse. I don't know if that's the correct number. I don't have owner's manuals, but I'm gonna replace it with this exact same fuse just to make sure that that's not the problem, because that has been a problem for me before on one of my other tractors. All right, so Brand new fuse. It is a mini fuse, but apparently I don't have any full-size ones, and yep, didn't solve the problem, which is kind of what I thought. I didn't think that was going to be the problem on this tractor. So the next thing that I'm going to go after testing is the starting solenoid, because when you test this, you can actually tell two things. You can tell if your solenoid is possibly bad, or you can tell if your ignition switch is probably bad. So if you remove this grommet back, you want to get to this hot side of the solenoid, and you want to test to make sure this cable is good, which according to the multimeter, it is. So there is power getting to the solenoid. Now, the one thing I'm going to have fun with, because I don't have 3 hands, hold on, let me figure this out real quick. All right, so after employing the help of the other cables, the hot side on the multimeter is now connected to this post on the solenoid. It's currently reading 0. So when you turn the key, what you want to do for in this test is, if the multimeter reads 12 volts when you turn the key to the start position, that means that the solenoid is closing and that power is being sent to the starter motor. So if I come over here, on position, nothing. So it's staying at 0, which means that the solenoid is not crossing over, which means it could be the solenoid or it could be the key. But that'll be for the next test, which the next test involves these 2 prongs right down here. And I'm actually a little unfamiliar with 2-prong solenoids. I'm used to single-prong solenoids, which is what's on the diesel over there. But basically, one of these or both of these, somehow when you turn the key, it should send 12-volt power to the solenoid, which is what causes it to cross over. So let me look up an electrical schematic so I don't look like a complete idiot here. All right, so after some Googling and a little bit of head scratching, this cable right here, this tab right here, this white wire, is the hot 12-volt input coming from the key switch. These 2 black wires on this tab right here are grounds, and you can actually see in here, they come and they connect to that bolt down there. I don't understand really why you need that to be a ground when it's already been bolted to the frame, which is already grounded, but I don't know, I'm not that smart. So what I want to look at to see on this post, which is currently passing in 0, I want to see if when I turn the key switch, it passes 12 volt into here. So let me get this rigged up again real quick. All right, so I pulled the wire off the solenoid, stuck that in there. So it's currently reading 0. So if it's working, it should read 12 volt when I turn the key. And it's not. So that means that 12 volt is not getting to the solenoid to click it over. However, one thing I do want to check is, if you look, these tabs and all this down here is extremely dirty. So just to double check everything, I'm going to pull the solenoid off and clean it. But another thing that I can do while I'm here is that, since these are ground, what I can do is, if I shove this in here and take this, if I stick it on this nut down here, you can see we're reading the same voltage as the battery, which means that this ground down here is good. So that's not the problem. So what I want to look at is these contacts and the solenoid. So I'm going to pull the solenoid off, clean these contacts and these ends of the cables really well, just to see if that's the problem. All right, so long story short, it's actually been a couple of, maybe a week even, between the last clip and this one now. Been a little bit busy. I've worked on this thing on and off for the past couple days. It's a lot easier to work on these types of projects when you don't have to do any filming, but in my quest to track down the starting problem, I've bypassed the safety switch, which normally when you push in the clutch, you'd have to do that in order for it to start. I bypassed that, tested it, that wasn't the problem. I did clean off this solenoid. I put a new contact here because the old one was a little bit too far gone. That didn't solve the problem. Back here, I bypassed the PTO switch, the electronic PTO switch, because that's also a safety switch. If you have the mower deck engaged and try to start it, it won't start. And then under the seat, It's not there right now, but there was a kill switch for the seat that was already bypassed. Tested that again, didn't work. So it's a problem with the 12-volt circuit. So what I'm gonna do is over here, just set that to ohms. In the vise here, this is the old PTO engagement switch. And what I'm gonna do, you can see right here, is when this is out, it reads infinite resistance. So electricity can't pass through it. When you push it in, and it reads 0, which means electricity can pass through it. So what I'm gonna do with this is rig that up so that I have a completely separate circuit from the key switch to send 12 volt to the solenoid. Basically, I'll bypass the key switch entirely to see if that's the problem. Another thing I did do is the original key switch was bad, it was too corroded, so I did get a new key switch, and that also didn't solve the problem. So I'm gonna rig up a independent circuit to send 12 volt to the solenoid, and then that'll officially tell us if it's somewhere in the key switch system. All right, so I got it made, rigged up. It's not really the way I want it to be, but if I drill it any further, it's not gonna have meat, so that's gonna do. I tested it for continuity. Electricity can pass through it, so in theory, this should work. Yep, spins over. So there's an issue with the in between the battery and the key switch. Either the key switch isn't getting, there's two areas I need to test. Either 12 volt is not getting to the switch, or 12 volt isn't getting from the switch to the solenoid. So I'll do a bit more troubleshooting, but first I'm gonna see if I can actually get this thing to fire up with this setup, just to see if it'll actually still even run. All right, so 12 volt system rigged up, ready to go. Keys on, it's choked, a little bit of throttle. It's got fuel in the tank. I don't know how old it is, but it is fuel. It's gonna take a bit because it's gotta suck it up into the filter here before it gets in the motor because the tank's under the seat, but we'll see if this thing will run. Finally, fuel in the filter. So it should start soon, hopefully. Alright. Give it a shot of the good stuff here. This will at least let us know we got spark. So we got a spark problem, which again relates to the 12 volt circuit. That's great. All right, so again, it's been a couple days and I've been busy. So the factory wiring in this tractor was not very great. So I've gone through and basically rewired the whole thing, minus the battery charging system, but that wasn't working originally. So everything's been rewired. All the bad wiring's out. So theoretically, if we choke it now, it should start up. All right, so I don't know the exact problem, but it was definitely somewhere in the wiring. So I'll get it reassembled, put back together, touch up a few things, and then it's good to go back to work. All right, so I've reassembled the entire tractor, but as I've gone through this process, I haven't done the best job of actually recording what I've been doing because I haven't designed it to be like a tutorial. So the issue in the beginning was this tractor wouldn't start. So how the electrical system's supposed to work is positive 12 volt comes into this post on the solenoid, and it also goes out through this red wire, which in turn enters the ignition switch right there. This 12 volt power is what enables the solenoid and also the armature. So over here, this wire, they're all black so you can't really tell, but this wire right here connects to this post on the solenoid. When you turn the key to the start position, it sends 12 volt down to here, which crosses these two terminals over, which allows 12 volt to travel down through this wire to the starter motor, which in turn spins the engine. Another thing to note, mostly on this switch, is that this wire right here, or this plug that you can see, is a ground wire. So this travels down, and this is bolted to the frame right here, as well as bolted to the frame right here is this ground side of the solenoid. This is a 4-post, which as far as Google tells me, means that this post is a dedicated ground. I don't know why they do that instead of having the solenoid itself be grounded, because it is bolted directly to the frame, but whatever. Now the more complicated side of this ignition switch is the armature side. So basically, if the armature is connected to a ground circuit, it will not cause spark. So what the ignition switch does is that when you turn it either in the run position or in the start position, it will disconnect. This is the wire that goes to it. It will disconnect from ground, which enables it to spark. When you turn the switch to the off position, it will reconnect the armature to ground, which then sends the electrical pulses to the ground, which in turn prevents the spark plugs from getting any spark, which in turn shuts off the engine. So it's actually relatively simple when you rewire it like this. And the other way the tractor is supposed to work when it was stock is that built into the PTO and the clutch and the seat, there's a series of kill switches that will either prevent the ground circuit from being closed. The seat switch is a ground switch, and basically what that does is if you jump off the seat while the tractor's running, it grounds the armature, which then turns off the spark, which kills the engine if you jump up off the seat while it's running. The other circuits are on the clutch and the PTO, and those are on the positive 12 volt circuit. What that prevents you from doing is you cannot have the PTO engaged, or if it had a mower deck on it, if the mower deck was engaged, you would not be able to start the tractor, and you have to have the clutch pressed in, therefore disconnecting the engine from the transmission in order to actually start the tractor. But in this case, we don't really care about any of those switches, so we rewired it in such a way where there are no switches. And the only other thing to know is there is a fuse on the positive input, which prevents excessive current from going to the switch, and therefore if that fuse blows up, that saves your ignition switch and everything else on that side of the circuit. So it's just kind of basically how it works and how I rewired it. The other thing is the charging system is not currently hooked up, but it wasn't originally working even with the old switch. So later I will find a way to hook that up, but it's not super important now. But basically what that does is while the tractor's running, it will send a positive 12 volt input back into the battery to keep your battery charged and prevent it from discharging. So that's just kind of a basic overview of what I've done, how it's been rewired, how it works, and yeah, the tractor's functional again, and we no longer have scrap metal. So that's good news.